An intelligent person is a tortured person. Intelligent people always have questions. Very few answers. Because for every answer, there's new questions. For every new discovery, there are new mysteries. That's called intelligence. As soon as you say, it has to be this way, it's the only way it can be, now you're talking religion. The way the creation is described in the Torah, in the Bible, is that God created a completed universe, not a young embryonic universe. Adam was created 20 years old. So when he opened his eyes and he had been alive for one moment, he was developed physically and mentally and so on to the age of 20. The trees that were created on Tuesday of creation, on the third day of creation, already had fruits on the sixth day of creation, 3 days later. You know, fruits, problem, eating from the fruits. So of all the fruits of the trees you may eat except this one. So all the trees already had fruits. So God did not create apple seeds. He created apple trees with apples. Some of them already rotting. Because, you know, that's what an apple tree looks like. So some of the apples were already falling off the tree because they were overripe. Which means that the world, the universe, was never young. That's an interesting consideration. If Adam had chopped down a tree and counted the rings, the tree is only 3 days old, but there would be trees with 200 rings, 1,000 rings, 2,000 rings, depending on the size of the tree when it was created. So God created a finished world, and there's a reason for that, which we will talk about in the second part of the program today. God created the world for a reason, and so there's no point in waiting for the world to grow up. By the time God finished creating, at the end of 6 days, the world was ready to function, which is what God wanted. A functioning world, not a developing world. And so he created it ready to function, ready to go. All right. Let's talk about monkeys. The first thing is, I am not a scientist of any type, of any kind. This is not a gathering of scientists, although you may be a scientist, I don't know. But this is not a scientific convention. We are laymen, lay people, who know a little bit about the opinions of science and want to figure out where that fits into our daily lives. What do we accept? What do we reject? What works for us and what doesn't? Which is a very rational thing to do, by the way. If some scientific evidence proved or indicated that there really is no such thing as love, we would ignore it. So what? Well, this guy took his mother to a lecture on Freudian psychology, and the topic was the Oedipus complex. And she listened for a long talk, and at the end, her son, who was a sophisticated, modern young man, said to her, "So, what do you think?" And she said, "Oedipus Schmedipus, you love your mother." Because some things are more important than theory. Some things are even more important than fact. So, what do we do with this information, with this body of knowledge? The first question is, Given a scientific theory, given scientific evidence of a certain fact, do we have freedom of choice? May we choose to reject or accept, or is there no option? If science determines that there's a certain reality or a certain fact, well then that's it, you have no choice. Sure, you can deny that human beings ever landed on the moon, but then you're making a fool of yourself. You really don't have that choice. So for a person to believe in creation today, when science can demonstrate the facts of evolution, is that really a choice? Do you have that freedom? Or do you feel compelled, intellectually at least, to accept what science teaches? Now, this is like fundamental rules of life. Science is a discipline, like psychology is, like medicine, like any profession. It has its rules. If you don't follow the rules, you're not a scientist. If you can't bring evidence, then your theory cannot be considered scientific, because science works by evidence, by proof, by testing, by reproducing, experimenting, and so on, until you establish some natural fact in the world. Life is not a science. So just as the psychiatrist must leave his profession at the office and not bring it home because it doesn't work, you can't be analyzing each other if you're going to get along. You have to trust. You have to enjoy. You can't be professional about your personal life. So you have to leave the rules of psychology. If you're a psychologist, you have to leave them in the office. Don't bring it home. Don't ever say to your wife, well, that's because your mother, don't ever say that. Don't be a psychiatrist at home. Even if you are a professional psychiatrist, and you certainly shouldn't be a psychiatrist at home when you're an amateur psychiatrist, which we all are. In the same way, if you're a detective, don't bring the rules of your profession home. Don't keep wiping up fingerprints. Leave your profession in your workspace. Don't bring it home. Because life is not a profession. Life works by different rules than the rules of science or the rules of psychology or the rules of detective work. Unfortunately, we're not schooled in the laws of life, in the rules of life. But we are very well schooled in all the other rules. And so it's very easy, tempting, and natural to bring those rules home, because you got to live by some rules. So whatever rules we are educated with, we try to apply those rules to life at home, to everyday life. Life has its own rules. So, do we have a choice? Science is a human product, which means that human beings, in an attempt to improve their lives, study the world around them, the natural world, in order to, in some way, harness the facts of nature, the power of nature, to serve us and make life better on Earth. That is the purpose of science. It is not that science is God and we must worship it. by obeying its laws. Quite the contrary. Our job is to interfere with nature, to improve on nature, to produce heat where there's only cold, or to cool things off where it's too hot. So we are not slaves to nature, we are the masters of nature. And that's what God meant when he said to the first human beings, be fruitful and multiply, fill the world and conquer it. You are not the victims of nature, you are to conquer nature. And science does an admirable job. But there are times when we start to worship science, and that, of course, is a false god. We are not here to suffer the dictates of science. So, if science tells us, even if natural law tells us that we must live a certain way, we can ignore it, overrule it, and change it. Because the world is ours to enjoy. We are not here to worship nature. In fact, what exactly is the nature of dogma? What does it mean to be dogmatic? Because there was a time, you probably remember, there was a time when religion was very dogmatic. These were the rules, take it or leave it. These are the rules, you can't even leave it, you have to take it. This is what you must do. This is what the religion dictates. There's no questioning, there's no arguing, and there are no exceptions. Remember that? Religion has come a long way. It's not dogmatic anymore. Except for little pockets of ultra-religious people. Religion generally has become very democratic. See if you like it. If you don't like it, look around, shop around. If this religion doesn't suit you, try another one. No religion suits you, that's fine. You want to be religious, that's okay too. How religious? Whatever makes you comfortable. A teenager came to his rabbi here in the Twin Cities years ago. He had been to a summer camp where he discovered many practices that no one ever taught him in Jewish life. The reading of the Torah, being called up to the Torah, he had never seen this. The observance of the Shabbat. He came home and he asked his rabbi to tell him about the laws of Shabbat. And the rabbi said, why? The boy was very insulted. What, am I not entitled to know? I have to have a reason? I got to justify my interest in Shabbat, in the laws of Shabbat? But then the rabbi started telling him certain things about Shabbat, and he said, so that's what I have to do? The rabbi said, well, you don't have to. You do whatever is comfortable. And this boy, who was a little precocious, said, I don't need a rabbi to tell me that I can do what I want to. Tell me what I'm supposed to do. I know I can do what I want to. I've been doing that all my life. So religion has become quite liberal. What has become dogmatic is science or social rules. I think a famous singer once said, everybody's got to serve somebody. If you're not dogmatic in your religion, you become dogmatic in something else. If you're not religious about the laws of Shabbat or kashrus, then you become religious about your health or about your political beliefs. We all are dogmatic about something. Why is that? I mean, assuming that you accept this as true, we are all dogmatic about something. And that's because without some dogma, we have no posture. We become a blob. We become Play-Doh. We have to take a position, and a strong position, on something that becomes our backbone. That becomes our posture. And from there, we can maneuver our way through life. But without a posture, without a vertebrae, we're not human beings. So if we don't have the dogma of religion, we take other dogma. The question is that a legitimate exchange? In other words, dogma is appropriate if we're talking about religion. It is not appropriate anyplace else. Human intelligence basically means this. I have a theory. I can explain the nature of the changing seasons and the effect that it has on the leaves on the trees. Whatever explanation I have is convincing and satisfying to my mind. Is it correct and true? Ich weiß nicht. I don't know. Could there be a better explanation? There can be. There probably is. There probably will be better explanations coming in the future as we learn more. If I say, my explanation is the only explanation, it's the only way it could possibly have happened, this is what happened, this is the way it is, this is the way it must be, I am no longer intelligent. Because intelligence means the ability to see both sides of an argument. That's why intelligent people don't make good political leaders. Because to be a political leader, you have to take a position and fight for it until you're dead. An intelligent person can see the other side of the argument, and so he gets nothing done. So you've got to be stubborn, you've got to be opinionated to be a political leader, but that's not an intelligence. That's not a sign of intelligence. An intelligent person is a tortured person. Intelligent people always have questions, very few answers, because for every answer there's new questions. For every new discovery, there are new mysteries. That's called intelligence. As soon as you say, it has to be this way, it's the only way it can be, now you're talking religion. You're not being sensible anymore. Now, why is it okay to be that way when it comes to religion? Well, it's not just religion. If your wife wants it a certain way, then to you, that is dogma. It has to be that way. Why? Because she wants it. There is no other possibility. There are no two sides to this coin. Why? Because if you are serving someone, then their will, their pleasure, their opinion is the only thing that counts. The fact that you may have a better idea is completely irrelevant. That takes getting used to, by the way. Because until we're married, we're encouraged to be intelligent. No matter what you're told in school, you're expected to ask a question, to have an opinion, to come up with a better idea. Then you get married and you try to do more of the same. It doesn't work. Because home life is not a classroom. It's not a theory. When you're serving someone else, their need becomes your dogma. The idea of dogma in religion comes from the fact that religion means to serve God, as we'll discuss later today. If you're serving God, then what he needs is the only consideration. You come up with a better idea, it's irrelevant. God wanted to bring a flood to wipe out all life on earth by making it rain 40 days and 40 nights. Noah may have had a better idea. Bill Cosby had a better idea. But it was irrelevant. So dogma is appropriate when you are serving someone else. Then only dogma is going to work. You want to find out exactly what the other person wants and exactly how they want it and where and when. Now you've got it right. That's dogma. But as we said before, science, natural law, is not God, and we are not here to serve it or worship it. It is here to serve us, and the more we know about it and the better we understand it, the better we can use it to our advantage. Now let's take a look at the nature of science itself. In order to understand any topic, to be able to claim that you have grasped the subject, you have to be able to paint the outer limits, the borders of that subject. No subject is limitless. No topic is endless. Every concept, every idea has a beginning and an end. It applies somewhere, sometimes, not all the time, and not everywhere. If you think the idea is endless and applies always, you haven't mastered the subject. Grasping an idea, literally, physically, if you want to picture this, you can't grasp a basketball because you can't get your fingers, I can't get my fingers, around the outer borders of the ball. So if I can't get around its limits, if I can't grasp its limits, then I can't grasp it. It's too big for me. So I can't claim to have grasped the basketball even though I'm holding it. I can know a subject, I can speak about a subject, I can't claim to grasp it until I see its limits. I know where it belongs, I can put it in its right place. But anytime I think an idea is endless, eternal, universal, and applies to all circumstances, all people, all the time, now I'm talking religion again. That's dogma. That's not grasping the idea. Therefore, to understand science, we have to know where it begins and where it ends. The person who believes that science has no end is not a scientist. He is worshiping scientism. The beginnings and the ends of nature, or of science, is that science deals with what is. You cannot use science to study that which is not. That make any sense? Science deals only with what has happened. It does not deal with what has not happened. Therefore, science deals with something. It cannot deal with nothing. At this point in history, the cutting edge of science, the next frontier in science, is going to be the study of that which is not. Will it still be science? Probably not. So science has reached its outer limit. It knows all there is to know about what is. The question is, where did what is come from? And the answer has to be from something that is not. Well, science can't go there. That is the natural border, the natural limit to the field of science. That doesn't mean that human beings are incapable of understanding and even grasping the knowledge of what is not. We'll talk about that in a second. Science can't go there because science has certain rules. Science cannot demonstrate what it can't reproduce. Science can't evaluate what it can't measure. And so that which is not does not lend itself to scientific pursuit. That doesn't mean that it doesn't lend itself to human intelligence. In fact, what makes human intelligence human, different and greater than animal intelligence, is that we are capable of understanding what is not. A simple example is, if you really know how to communicate, then you're doing two things. You understand what you hear, and you understand what wasn't said. Because you got to read between the lines to really be able to communicate. You have to hear what is said, and you have to hear what was not said. You have to see what is there. You also have to see what is missing. Human intelligence can handle, can understand, can grasp that which is not. And therefore, the science, if you want to call it that, the science of God is knowable, even though God is not measurable and God is not available to scientific testing. So it's the limit of science that we're talking about, not the limit of human intelligence. When science says the world evolved from a big bang, human beings evolve from apes, that opinion sits someplace between what is and what isn't. Because if we go back 15 billion years, we're talking about what isn't. Because what happened 15 billion years ago to the physical universe is as unavailable as that which does not exist. So now we're talking about an opinion, a theory, and that's why it's called the theory of evolution. We're talking about a theory that doesn't really lend itself to scientific scrutiny, because nobody was there, because you can't reproduce it, because you can't check it out. So you're talking about a scientific or educated guess. And it may be a very good one. Human beings are creative, ingenious, and we can come up with incredible, impressive theory. Is this in conflict with what the Torah says? Is it in conflict with what religion teaches us? The answer is it can't be in conflict. The Torah tells us what happened, not what might have happened. Religion is telling you from the horse's mouth, pardon the expression, how and when this happened. Science is trying to figure out how it could have happened, what might have happened. Is there a conflict? There's no conflict. There's no conflict. I can have many good theories about where this lectern came from and how it got here. Good theories, every one of them. But none of them are true. Some guy lugged it in, which is kind of boring. I had much more interesting theories about it. So is there a conflict between my theory and the fact? No. I'm trying to give you a theory, and you're interrupting me with the facts. So the Torah doesn't say this could have happened, this might have happened. Torah tells you God said, and it was. Is that in any way a contradiction to the theory of evolution? No, it's not. It only becomes a conflict when those who teach the theory of evolution present it as a fact. The Big Bang happened 13 billion years ago in February. Now we got a conflict because they can't both be true. But if evolution is a theory, the best theory that human minds can come up with, and the Bible is God's word on what he did and when he did it, there's no conflict. There's no contest. If somebody says 4, and you're asked, well, how did they get to the 4? How did they arrive at 4? You can say, oh, they must have added 2 and 2. That's a good theory. It's a very good theory, because 2 and 2 is 4. That's amazing. But then you ask the guy, how did you get to 4? He says, I subtracted 4 from 8. You say, oh, come on, you didn't do that. You know, that's what I did. But why would you do that when you could have gotten to 4 by adding 2 and 2? I don't know, but that's what I did. So if you say, but 2 and 2 equals 4, yes, you're right. Did this guy get to the 4 by doing that? No, he didn't. He went the other way. Did the world come into existence through evolution? Who could say for sure? Not a scientist. If a scientist says for sure, this is the only way it could happen, he's not a scientist anymore. He's being dogmatic. And the science of evolution is not nearly as solid as 2 and 2 equals 4. So we should never get caught up in this tension between science and religion. There is no tension. If you want to know what happened, only God can tell you. You want to know what might have happened? Hey, let's make theories, all you want. Good theories, poor theories, we'll argue, we'll debate. It's good for the brain, keeps you young. I'm not sure that this is exactly true, but I think that the debate on the theory of evolution has changed over time. Because it was first called theory on the origins of the universe. Evolution was to explain the origins of the universe. That didn't happen. We are no closer to the origins than we were before. In fact, we're further away. We never thought it would be 15 billion years. We just keep pushing it further and further away. But we haven't gotten closer to origin because we don't know how nothing turned into something. And that's what we need to know if we're going to understand the origins. Now, The theory of evolution is here to tell you the age of the universe, not its origins. Speaking of ancestry, Darwinian evolution, we have one very fundamental problem. The scientist discovers a progression. There is a progression from lower forms of life to higher forms of life. You can actually map it out, and it fits like a puzzle. Very convincing. Question, fundamental question, besides the missing link. The fundamental question is, what are we seeing? When we see this progression, what are we seeing? Are we seeing ancestry or are we seeing sequence? One scientist said, people who are worried in the inner cities, people who are worried about the ecology, came up with a brilliant idea to camouflage the dumps. Old cars get piled up in dumps, and they're ugly. The solution is cover them with earth, grow some grass, and you have a nice hill. It's a nice idea. He said, imagine 1,000 years from now, scientists will dig up those hills, and they will discover that the further you dig, the bigger the car gets. And so there's a sequence here. In the 60s, the cars were very big. Then they got smaller, and then they got smaller, and then they got smaller, and then they got bigger. How sensible would it be to claim that the big cars gave birth to the little ones? Well, look at the progression. Come on. You see, the fin was this big, then it became this big. Come on. Yes, there is a progression. But what does progression indicate? A sequence or an ancestry? If we can't resolve that question, then we're just guessing again. God says, on the first day I created light. On the second day I created a heaven. On the third day I created vegetation. On the fourth day, there's a sequence. The smaller animals were created first. The fish, the birds, the bugs. The big animals were created later. And the human being came after that. Correct. The sequence makes sense. Who said anything about ancestry? You know, people say that you buy a dog that looks like you. You know, sometimes you see a similarity between the dog and its owner. Well, it's a fact. There are similarities there. Is there ancestry there? Boy, that dog looks like you. Well, what are you implying? I mean, is that the opposite of, boy, your children don't look like you? That's scary. But that the dog looks like you is not scary. It does not imply ancestry. By the way, without going into the whole evolution of species, how different is a human being from a chimpanzee genetically? Very little. I think 89% of our genetic codes are similar. 89% of our genetic code. This does not mean that a chimpanzee is 89% human. Doesn't mean that at all. It also doesn't mean that a human being is 89% monkey. The difference, the vast difference between a human being and a monkey is not in the genetic code. So it's not impressive to say our genetics are similar. We're not that dissimilar from an elephant either, or from a flower, from a dandelion. All life is made up of the same stuff, more or less. The question is, what distinguishes one life form from another? It's not just the genetics. In fact, what determines the genetics? If everything in the universe is made up of atoms, then we're all related. Then not only can the smaller car be the descendant of the larger car, we can be the descendant of a larger car. Hey, we're both made up of atoms, molecules. The stuff of existence is not what creates the distinctions. It's their function and their purpose that makes them different. In fact, it is the function and purpose that determines which genes you're going to have, what kind of genetic code you're going to have, and what kind of DNA you're going to have. Not the other way around. It's not that your genetics determines what you are. What you are determines your genetics. So when God said, "Let there be grass," he meant, let's have a set of genes or molecules that acts like grass. When he said, let's have animals, he meant a set of stuff, the building blocks of life, that behaves like an animal. The basis of evolutionary theory, of Darwinian theory, is basically two principles on which we speculate and expand, extrapolate. The two fundamental principles of Darwinian theory are basically this. Number one, all living organisms descend from other living organisms. That which is alive is a descendant, was born to that which was alive. Living things come from living things. The second fundamental principle is that living things didn't always have spines. That in the early stages of life, there were no spines. Now, if you take these two principles, these two assumptions, you basically come up with the evolution of species. Because if all life comes from life, and originally life did not have a spine, then we have evolved from non-vertebrates to vertebrates. That's it. That's the whole theory. Does that mean we came from monkeys? It doesn't mean that at all. And Darwin is probably turning over in his grave, or as Yogi Berra says, if he were alive today, he would turn over in his grave, at the suggestion that he thought people came from monkeys. That's a lot of sensationalism that was added on to his theory. He claims only two things. Life comes from life, and life didn't always have a spine. Which really doesn't mean much in terms of ancestry. Because not having a spine doesn't describe anything. So scientifically speaking, you can't say that which has a spine evolved or devolved from a form of life that didn't have a spine, because you can't define something by what it doesn't have. So you can't say there were creatures without spines. That doesn't mean anything. Strawberries don't have spines. Did we evolve from strawberries? Secondly, all life comes from other living things? Don't think so. Before the Big Bang, there was no life. Life comes from dead things. Which brings us back to the cutting edge question. How does nothing become something? Once it becomes something, science can take over and come up with wonderful theories. But until it becomes a something, we're clueless. Interesting thing. We're now reading in the Torah. Last week we read the first chapter of Bereshis, the story of creation. Now we're reading the story of Noah, the story of Abraham, the early years of history. It's an amazing thing. There was the belief in God, and then there was idolatry. Happened pretty quickly. Human beings believed in God because Noah, Adam, spoke to God. But then they started to question, and they started to believe in idols. And by the time Abraham came around, nobody believed in God anymore. Everybody worshipped idols. That's pretty quick. But think of this. The truth is, no one ever believed in God, and then they started to believe in idols. No one believed in God. They spoke to God. In the beginning of history, in the beginning of the description of creation in the Torah, there's no mention of belief in God. God spoke to Adam and said, "Don't eat that." He said, "Well..." Did he believe in God? Believe in God? So, the relationship with God began as an experience, not as a belief. The belief in idolatry began as a belief. We usually assume the opposite. An idol is something you can see, something you can weigh, something you can measure. God, he's unknowable. So God can only be contacted through faith. Whereas physical things, this we know. Turns out to be the opposite. We never believed in God. God was an experience. We started to believe in physical things, in idols. We worshipped the fertility god. Well, fertility is knowable. Well, a little mysterious, but it's physical. Thunder gods. Thunder is knowable. So idol worship was the first example of belief. Before that, there was God. There was no belief. Question is, how do human beings go from knowing God to believing in idols? Why would we do that? If you've spoken to God, why would you believe the will of an idol that doesn't speak? It's a good question, isn't it? How do you go from speaking to God to depending on a thing that doesn't speak? And I think that King David and Tillim keep saying that. Their gods don't speak. They have a mouth that doesn't speak. They have feet that don't. And he's marveling, like, what are you doing? Why would anybody do this? Why would you submit your will and your life, sacrifice your firstborn to something you believe in when you have a God that you can speak to? Maybe you can't. Your grandfather did. So they had the knowledge of God, intimate knowledge of God. They spoke to each other, and they forgot that and exchanged it for a belief in stuff. Why? Do we do this too? Are we still at it? Are we still turning the knowable into matters of faith? In the case of turning science into a religion, yes. We're adding faith where it doesn't belong. On the other hand, God is the God of our fathers. It's not something you believe in. It's our experience. You cannot speak of Jewish history without mentioning God any more than you can speak of Jewish history and not mention Abraham. God is part of our historical experience, not our faith. The belief in science is pure faith. Maybe pure is not a good word. Blind faith. Faith in something that should be worshiping you, and you're worshiping it instead. So, is there a monkey in our family? No honest scientist would ever say yes. That's the Reader's Digest version. That's the popularized version. No scientist will tell you that there's a monkey in your ancestry, because we don't know that, and there's no reason to assume that. All we know is all living things come from living things, and living things didn't always have a spine. Now you can make of that whatever you want. But it's speculation. The Torah, on the other hand, says that the world has a creator who has an end goal. It's not that he's good at creating worlds. He's not. Creating worlds is not his thing. His thing is oneness and holiness. And he created the world to achieve a greater oneness and a greater holiness. There's an end goal. We don't exist to exist. We don't exist to survive. We don't survive to survive. There's an end goal. And for that alone, a rational mind would say, if I have a choice, and I do, If I have a choice, then rationally, I choose to believe that which enhances my life, not that which impoverishes my life. To know that God has an end goal and that we are not here merely to evolve, or as some say, to evolve into extinction. Of course, 10 billion years from now. Not exactly stuff that keeps you up at night. But philosophically, very deflating. We evolve to survive, and we will not survive. That doesn't give you a lot of enthusiasm for life. To live with the belief that we evolved over 5 billion years into human beings so that we will become extinct in another 2 billion years. What exactly is the sanctity of life? That God created the world but has no interest? Not much better. Intelligent design, very popular these days, at least controversial. Intelligent design doesn't mean anything. Evolution is also an intelligent design. If we evolve to survive, to adapt to the new environment, that's intelligent. And how do we do that? Because there is a DNA molecule whose only job is to direct the other molecules and tell them where to go and what to do. There is intelligence. Whether you believe in God or not, there is intelligence. The question is, this intelligence that exists in nature, does it know what it's doing? Does it have an end goal? Belief in God doesn't mean believing in an intelligent design or intelligent designer. That is unquestionable. The question is, this intelligent designer, what does he want? If he wants nothing, then we're back to zero again. The good news is that this intelligent designer also has a desire. There is an end goal, and it is not extinction. On the contrary, the end goal is eternity. That which was not becomes. And now, that which is temporary acquires immortality. That's called evolving. When you go from nothing to something, and this something is temporary, but the temporary something acquires eternity, I can go with that kind of evolution. That can be described as progress. Now I understand the sanctity of life. A rational human being chooses that because it's good for him. It serves him better. Rational people do what serves them better. We don't worship science. All this makes sense? Yes, no, maybe, a little? That's the kind of faith we can live with, because it makes life livable, worth living. The other kind of faith strips life of all sanctity, of all significance, of all importance. So we celebrate life. We celebrate life because it came from God and is becoming more like God. That's significant. A universe that came from nowhere and is going nowhere is not significant.
Partner with Rabbi Friedman. Visit itsgoodtoknow.org/support.